It gives me special pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Jim Ketterer, to you. Jim comes to us from Bard College, where he is Director of the Globalization and International Affairs Program and Dean of International Studies. Over a distinguished career of service in more areas than I have time to mention, he is well recognized as an expert on international affairs and development with a primary focus on the Middle East. He will talk to us today on the U.S. view of Arab Spring, misreading and missed opportunities. It is a subject that has concerned and perplexed us for many years and remains highly relevant today. Jim.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you don't mind if I get up and move around. I had a bit of a long drive here, so it's good to get the blood flowing. And I thought this is such a beautiful room that I should take advantage of being here on stage, but not in front of my great photos. So I do want to talk about the Arab Spring, which seems like it's fading into the past quickly, both substantively and in terms of one's memory about it, but use that as a case study to think about how the U.S. Government and U.S. citizenry engages the Middle East and what we get right and what we get wrong, and how we might apply some of the lessons learned from what's happened over the past few years to the challenges that the U.S. faces in the Middle East today, which are many. Just reading the news every day, there's no lack of things to talk about and to be concerned about. So, but I want to focus on Egypt also because I have personal experience with having been there throughout this period of the Egyptian revolution and the years following. And so it makes for an interesting case study kind of analytically, but also just personally, and my own experiences can hopefully bring something to bear to the conversation. So I like to see what happens if I do this. I like to start with this picture, which was taken by a friend of mine. This is almost sort of at the end of the story, and then we'll flip back to the beginning of the story. This is over the Mediterranean Sea. It's right near the northern Egyptian city of Alexandria, and it just has some elements that I think are important to the story. One is just the people here cheering on the supposed return of the military to the situation that we will talk about in detail. The Egyptian flag, just the presence of the flag. You know, most countries in the world, for those of you who have spent any time traveling or living overseas, you know that most countries in the world don't fly their flags with the same regularity that Americans fly their flags. Most places, people don't fly the flag off their front porch or their cars or those sorts of things. But I was struck when I arrived in Egypt that people really were, the flag was everywhere. And we'll see throughout this presentation different flags at different points and different things being symbolized. But just this deep sense of Egyptian nationhood and Egyptian identity is an important thing to keep in mind in this story. And then this helicopter, paid for by the American taxpayers. We give the Egyptians about $1.3 billion a year since the late 70s and the Camp David Accords, most of it in the form of military equipment, something that we'll spend a lot of time talking about. Anyway, I think it's all wrapped up in this photo that a friend of mine took at a very tumultuous moment in this story. So the thing to keep in mind, I think, that's important as we begin the story about U.S. relations with Egypt is that for a very long time, things didn't change. It was just stability. That was the word that you would hear used a lot in conversations in official circles, and that was really the nature of the relationship. So here we have Hosni Mubarak, after having become president when Anwar Sadat was assassinated at a military parade in Cairo. And I have to point out this guy to some of my students when I'm talking about Egypt, but I think you probably know who he is. They both, obviously, this is in the West Wing, this is in the Oval Office, and they both look a little maybe surprised to be where they are, but cheery about it. One person has changed here, one person has not. Both looking, I think, very comfortable in their situation. There's a resident of Chappaqua in this picture, and I think both seem to be very comfortable in their jobs and enjoying the moment. Not such a warm embrace, but still maintaining the relationship after 9/11. After the U.S. invasion of Iraq, the relationship became very strained. There was a great deal of pressure put on the Egyptian government from Washington to open up the system and to democratize. But nevertheless, it was still considered a bulwark of American foreign policy. And this is the last in a series of photos with Hosni Mubarak. This is the one that's not taken in Washington. This is in Cairo, and President Obama made a decision to give one of his first, it wasn't the first, but one of the first international speeches as president, and to do it as kind of a reset with the Muslim world, that with ties that had been so deeply strained following 9/11, following the invasion of Iraq in particular, and then all that happened in the occupation of Iraq and all that went wrong. So President Obama went to Cairo, obviously met with President Mubarak, but gave a very highly regarded a speech that was watched around the Muslim world. This is at Cairo University. And I can recall the speech being broadcast here in the United States, but choosing to do the speech in Egypt not only highlighted the centrality of Egypt's geopolitical importance to the United States, but also its centrality in the broader Muslim world, not just of Arab countries, but the Muslim world beyond the Arab world. And it was very well received, so much so that I don't know if you can read this. This is the kind of thing you could find in the market. Obama, the new Tutankhamun of the world. The reality is you could go to the market and have your name put on such a thing for about maybe $3 or $4, if you're so inclined. But how did we get from this moment in 2009 to this in 2013, where Obama and Osama bin Laden kind of mashed up together and seen as a problem rather than a partner? And so that's the story that I'd like to talk about, is how we got from those moments of stability, those positive feelings in 2009, and to what seemed like was a positive thing that really has turned bad all around. So the story really starts off in Tunisia. I lived in Tunisia a long time ago, and it would probably be one of the last places I would imagine that a revolution would start. Not just a Tunisian revolution, but a revolution that would spread to many other countries. And so, Tunisia, it's not my line, but many people used it when I was there. It was kind of like East Berlin with palm trees. And it's another reference that my students wouldn't get because they're like, East Berlin? What was that? But I suspect you know what I'm talking about. And so a very highly entrenched authoritarian state run by a former intelligence chief. The place was really locked down tight and doing fairly well economically. So it didn't seem to have the classic signs of a place that was about to have a revolution. Nevertheless, this man, Mohammed Bouaziz, set himself on fire after having been harassed by the police and living in a system in which he felt he had no way out, a system that was highly corrupted, etc. And this is the then president of Tunisia, President Ben Ali, visiting him. Unfortunately, Mohammed did not survive. And this really began a cascade of events. There was a similar thing that had gone on in Egypt and hadn't been paid attention to much outside of Egypt. Maybe before the Egyptian Revolution, a young man named Khaled Said, who was pictured here by his family, was dragged out of an internet cafe by the security forces and was killed eventually. He was blogging things that were seen as being disruptive to the regime. So these things then led to mass protests. And so the stability that had been in place had largely been centered around authoritarian regimes that had maintained themselves even after that moment when the Cold War ended and it seemed like democracy was breaking out all over. The Middle East and North Africa somehow seemed insulated from even those massive changes in the global system, and authoritarianism maintained itself. So now, the end of 2010, the beginning of 2011, it seemed like things were finally starting to change in a big and dramatic and rapid way. And so the Tunisian revolution then is followed by Egypt. This is Tahrir Square. The center of Cairo was the center of the revolution. It means in Arabic liberation, fittingly. And it was just an incredible moment. And I can remember being in my living room in Albany, New York, on the phone with the person who was about to become my boss, my new boss, and asking if I was interested in going to Egypt to run the office of a large educational non-governmental organization, an NGO, and watching these scenes in Tahrir Square while I'm on the phone and hearing myself say, yes, I would like to go there. And I very much wanted to go there because it was seen as such an important but also hopeful moment. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, that this was really a hopeful moment. This idea that, Egypt is free, that something was finally being unleashed, and that bread, freedom, social justice were the kinds of things now that were being written on the wall, were being spoken out loud, that it was this spirit that seemed to be underscoring this revolutionary moment. And as things unfolded in Egypt during this moment of the revolution, it became clear that the military was positioning itself to be on the side of the people, that it was protecting the people from the police, who were in many ways seen as the main targets of the revolution and of the revolutionaries. That this all started on Police Day, a holiday meant to honor the police. And before we proceed there, just as a way to show the sense of hope in a better way than I could describe, I just want to play a bit of a video that has closed captioning. And this is a video that showed in many places in Egypt, and when I arrived shortly after the revolution, it was playing everywhere. It was kind of like the backdrop. And it really, I think, captures this sense of people coming together, pulling off something that had never really anticipated that might get to this point, and bridging gaps in society to do so. Economic gaps, differences in the way in which people present their religiosity. Some women are veiled, some women are not. All the sorts of things that tend to make Egypt a very hierarchical place seem to be suspended for this hopeful moment. And so I thought I might not play this whole video. It goes on quite a bit, but this will give you a sense.
نزلت وقلت أنا مش راجع وكتبت بدمي في كل شارع سمعنا اللي ما كانش سامع واتكسرت كل الموانع سلاحنا كان أحلامنا وبكرة واضح قدامنا من زمان بنستنى بندور مش لاقيين مكاننا في كل شارع في بلادي صوت الحرية بينادي في كل شارع في بلادي صوت الحرية بينادي رفعنا راسنا في السماء والجوع ما بقاش بيهمنا أهم حاجة حقنا ونكتب تاريخنا بدمنا لو كنت واحد مننا بلاش ترغي وتقول لنا نمشي ونسيب حلمنا وبطل تقول كلمة أنا في كل شارع في بلادي صوت الحرية بينادي في كل شارع في بلادي صوت الحرية بينادي
أيادي مصرية سمرة ليها في التمييز ممدودة وسط الزئير بتكسر البراويز طلع الشباب البديع قلبوا خريفها ربيع وحققوا المعجزة صحوا القتيل من القتل اقتلني قتلي ما هيعيد دولتك تاني بكتب بدمي حياة تانية لأوطاني دمي ده ولا الربيع الاتنين بلون أخضر وببتسم من تعدي ولا أحساني
في كل شارع في بلادي.
Well, back to our story, back to the narrative. I wanted you to see that encapsulation musically and in video of this sense of hope. So, as I've said, the U.S.-Egyptian relationship is very important to both sides in governmental levels and in many other ways. And in the summer of 2011, there was the normal rotation of U.S. ambassadors. And the new ambassador who was nominated by the president, in the process, it's the same as judges. They have to then go before the Senate for confirmation, was Ann Patterson, very distinguished diplomat who had also been ambassador to Pakistan and I think Venezuela as well. And so here she is at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee during her confirmation process. And so it's on C-SPAN 2, but I was in Egypt watching this. Many people were watching it as well because the relationship is so important. And Ambassador Patterson, in her testimony, talked about the ways in which the U.S. government was supporting organizations that were involved in the transition to democracy in Egypt, and that we were supporting them through the U.S. Agency for International Development. And so the Egyptian government said, well, that's very interesting. And the Egyptian government at this moment was the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, so the military had taken over when Hosni Mubarak was removed. And they said, well, we'd like the names and addresses of those people who are receiving American government money because we'd like to go visit them. And they did, in fact. And we'll see in a couple different stages that these people were, in some cases, arrested for receiving U.S. government money. And it created an issue between the U.S. and Egyptian governments as well, a moment of tension. This idea that the U.S. government was circumventing the process, was circumventing the sovereignty of the Egyptian government, and was sending money directly to organizations that may or may not have been supported by the Egyptian government. And we can see this is one person who was arrested later in a different crackdown, and she's on trial. In Egypt, you're put in a cage when that's happening. And I don't know if you can tell, reading a book by George Orwell. So I think it's an intentional choice. It was a sign when that happened that things might not be going quite as smoothly as one thought when people were saying Egypt is free in Tahrir Square initially, when it was bread and social justice and freedom, that it was going to be more complicated than it appeared. Another of the incidents that made it appear that it was going to be more complicated was when there were lots of protests that happened when the revolution happened, when the change of government happened. Kind of people had this pent-up desire to express themselves on any number of issues. So big national issues like the Constitution and politics at a high level, but also local issues, schools, the building of churches, which continues to be controversial in Egypt. 10% of the population is Christian, but it can be a tense relationship, and it's manifested often in the building of churches, and lots of the other local issues that affect us all around the world. How do cities work, and how do you get the garbage picked up, and all of those sorts of things. And so one of these protests happening in an area near a building called Maspero, with a Christian groups of people, and this picture is blurry because this vehicle is about to run over several of these people and kill them, and many people were killed at this incident. And it was another sign that things might not be going quite as smoothly. This was yet another one of those. This is back in Tahrir Square, the very place that was the epicenter of the revolutionary moment. There's a video that also goes along with this incident. And this woman and a friend, companion, are walking along, and then there's some small protest happening, but it doesn't appear that she's part of it. But then she is taken down, attacked, kicked, her clothing stripped from her. And this is all happening a couple of long blocks away from the U.S. Embassy. So the cameras picked this up, and this was broadcast around the world in the way that CNN, when they tend to broadcast the same kinds of images for a 24-hour news period, and this was certainly one that was broadcast quite a lot. Another moment that got one's attention to say, this isn't going so smoothly. This was another one of those moments. There was a football match between the main football team in Egypt and one of the dominant football/soccer teams on the continent of Africa, and their supporters, and they were playing in Port Said, the northern city of Port Said. And the fans of this main team are also highly organized, very much involved in the conduct of politics, and so it's highly politicized in a way that happens in many places in the world where politics have for a long time been squelched. They come out in other ways. In places like Egypt, but not just Egypt, other places too, where for a long time it was impossible to express oneself politically, it would come out in things like student clubs, or student-run newspapers, or football clubs. Other kinds of associations would become heavily politicized because you couldn't do things that were political in the normal course of politics. So the parliament kind of became depoliticized, so football clubs became more politicized. Anyway, that's a long way of explaining why this incident wasn't just a football riot of fans getting out of control, but these were the supporters of this team being specifically targeted because of their politics, stabbed, caught in fires, thrown off the top of the stadium to their deaths. And it was a really kind of searing moment in Egypt. I can remember one of my staff members coming to me, and he just was absolutely beside himself that things had gotten to this point, that the hope of the revolution seemed to now, this was an incident that really made people question what's going on. It feels like the country's spinning out of control. And here's some pictures of some of the young men who were killed in that incident. This is back in Cairo at the walls outside of their club. Amidst all this, though, although those I just showed you a series of negative things, of kind of cautionary moments, there were also some hopeful moments. One of them was at the end of 2011 when they had elections for parliament. And I have worked on elections. I've worked on elections here in the US, but I've worked on elections helping to run them, and in some cases being an election observer around the world. And so I've been able to witness firsthand many occasions where a country's holding their first free and fair election. It's often not their first election, but it's the first one that people know that really matters, that's truly free and fair. And it really is a moving moment, and as an American, it is a reminder that we ought not to take these things for granted. And this was one of those moments. I didn't have anything to do with this election, but I had the day off because everything was closed, and I wandered around quite a bit and just observed what was happening. And I didn't take this picture, but this is a typical scene. You know, people had put their fingers in ink. When you vote, so it's indelible ink. You can't go back through more than one time, but they're proudly displaying it. They're happy that they could vote. And you, as I saw in many other elections in other parts of the world, you see people, standing in line for hours. People are dressed up. They're proud of this moment. People who have waited their entire lives to vote in an election that matters, finally being able to do it. I mean, these are young people. They didn't have to wait that long, but some people have to wait decades to cast a vote that counts. And so it was a hopeful moment. It was also a moment for me and many others to see that there were certain groups that were well positioned to take advantage of the elections. I mean, to do well in the elections. And there were other groups who were highly disorganized. So many of the groups that came out of Tahrir Square that were centered around these young revolutionaries weren't very well organized. That's not that surprising. They're young. They had no experience with running elections. I mean, it's not, intuitive. It really comes down to the sorts of things that win elections anywhere, whether it's in Cairo or Chappaqua. You've got to organize. You've got to get the right candidates. You've got to turn out the vote. You've got to do all of those things and more. And the revolutionaries weren't particularly good at that. They were great at being on CNN. They were great at writing op-eds in the New York Times. They weren't so great at hitting the hustings in local districts. Some groups, though, like the Muslim Brotherhood, were very organized. They were ready to roll. They knew how to pick candidates that were from the neighborhoods. They knew how to turn out the vote in blocks. They knew they had polling. They had resources behind them. And so after Election Day, in this moment of hope, when the parliament actually took office, it was a bit of a shock to people to see how things were appearing. This might be a bit of an unfair picture to see, somebody sleeping and somebody's on their phone. And, I've worked in the New York State Legislature. You might be able to find some pictures like this in Albany too. So, to be fair, legislatures have their good moments and bad moments. But it was a combination of the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist groups known as Salafis who dominated these elections. And this really, for people who had been heavily involved in the revolution, and many people had, for people who had great hopes about what was coming out of the revolution, and many of them certainly did, this also was a shock. This was a moment in saying, is this really quite what we bargained on when we had this revolution? Particularly because this group their main task was to write the first post-revolutionary constitution. And in large part, while they were doing that, they were also focusing on issues that, for people who weren't supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, caused concern. Things like women wearing bikinis at the beach at resorts, or the selling of beer in hotels, or the sorts of things that played to their base, but sent a concern that that the Muslim Brotherhood was going to be focused on those sorts of issues and not these central issues to putting together a new government following the revolution and moving beyond having a military regime in power. Now, just keep in mind that the military had been in power in Egypt since 1952. And so people were inclined to move beyond military rule and really take advantage of this revolutionary moment. Following the parliamentary elections, then there were presidential elections. Initially, the Muslim Brotherhood said that they would not run a candidate for the presidential elections. Then they said they would. The person who was initially going to run was disqualified for a variety of issues. And this man, who eventually won the elections, Mohammed Morsi, was the alternate candidate, which earned him the nickname the spare tire in Egypt. Egyptians have really a tremendous sense of humor. And he's an engineer, received his PhD from the University of Southern California, and though had been involved in the Muslim Brotherhood for a long time, not a natural politician, very kind of awkward in his speaking style, certainly awkward in his administration, and coming also into office with huge pressure, having won this very close election against a former general, coming in with the economy in tatters, with the country now seeming that security was really just absolutely falling apart on a daily basis, and it being unclear if he was really in charge. Was he able to really access the levers of government, or was, to use a phrase borrowed from Turkey, was the deep state really running things? So he began with lots of trepidation. Here's a picture of another resident of Chappaqua. Secretary Clinton came on a trip to Egypt and, among other things, came up to Alexandria, where she was presiding over a ceremony that was going to take what was known as the American Center, a State Department installation, and upgrade it to an American consulate that would bring in more diplomats, more services, more programs. And my organization worked very closely with the embassy and what was about to become the consulate. So I was invited to this event. You can't see me, but I'm sitting right in front of this guy who's the governor of Alexandria. And it was a very nice event in this beautiful building. And this is the Consul General, Candace Putnam. Here's Ambassador Patterson, Secretary Clinton. And it really was meant to be one of the things that sent the signal that this, from the Washington perspective, is still a very important relationship, and we want to support that relationship. Unfortunately, things had disintegrated so much in the country that the juxtaposition between this scene inside and these kinds of scenes outside, you can see I took this image from the internet. It's not mine or anything that a friend of mine took, but there's a lot of things going on in this picture that are worth noting. Number one, when I left that ceremony at the consulate, it was absolute bedlam outside. It had already been tense going in. When I was waiting to go into the consulate and going through security, there were crowds that were chanting. They were throwing things at the people in line. In fact, there was at one point I looked up and I saw a very ripe tomato headed right for me, and I ducked instinctively. And unfortunately, the Coptic priest standing behind me took it. So I'm sorry, Father, that happened, but it wasn't so funny. It really was very hostile. Once we went back out into that crowd, it was absolute chaos. And in this picture, you can see a variety of things that are very anti-American, and anti-Americanism has been a kind of a long strain in Egypt, but this was taking on kind of a much more pointed feel to it, and much more directed at Secretary Clinton herself. And it was both sarcastic and negative and potentially quite dangerous. Back in Cairo, on a regular basis, particularly every Friday, which is the beginning of the weekend in Egypt, every Friday became a moment for more protests, for more violent protests, for ways to vent the collective spleen about whatever the issue of the day and the week happened to be. And you started to see the involvement of these soccer fans, also with groups, these anarchy groups like Black Bloc and others. It really just gave it the feel. I mean, my organization, we used to have to close for long spans of time because we just couldn't get around the city. We couldn't guarantee the safety of the staff coming and going, or of students coming to our facility. And we weren't alone. I mean, it really felt like Cairo, a city of 20 million people that on the best of days just barely operates. It's a great place and I love it, but you know, kind of order and regularity is not the kind of the one of the high points of life in Cairo. So when things are really falling apart, it just became impossible to get anything done. And then you add on this sense of, in this case, anarchy, this sense of violent protest on a regular basis. It really felt like the wheels were coming off. If any of you have ever been to Cairo, and you might know that the U.S. Embassy is still in downtown central Cairo. Most U.S. embassies that had been in downtown locations have been closed and moved out of town for security reasons, particularly after the 1998 bombings of our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania by Al-Qaeda. But the embassy in Cairo, though it is rather a fortress, is still downtown in a very nice area called Garden City, just down the street from the British embassy. So this is an area that if you had taken this picture in, say, 2010, none of these kinds of walls would be there. This hotel back here, a very nice hotel. At one point during this tumultuous period, the lobby had been invaded by protesters and absolutely ripped up and burned up, and all of this would have seemed unthinkable. And so they put up these big walls to try to add another layer of protection to the U.S. Embassy. It's also was always funny to me that the Egyptian entrepreneurial spirit was such that somebody put this hole in the fence, and once in a while there'd be somebody on the other side of that fence sort of standing guard and asking for a small amount of money to be allowed through the hole in the fence, because your only other alternative was to walk several blocks around in very hot sun to get to the main door of the embassy. So I confess that I paid £1 here once in a while to go through that hole in the fence. Then somebody would close it up and it would be reopened again. Anyway, it gave another sense that security was kind of barely hanging on, even in this very nice neighborhood, even right around the U.S. Embassy. And on September 11th in 2012, that really completely fell apart, and people got onto the grounds of the U.S. Embassy. You can see the embassy flag down here. We were talking before about flags as well, the Egyptian flag. We see the appearance of a different flag, one that you might recognize now from ISIS. This really isn't ISIS, but it's bringing into the equation symbolism that deeply concerned many of my Egyptian friends who said, this really is taking a very negative turn now. Morsi was president. People said, it's really on him. The Egyptian government needs to be recreating some sense of order and stability in the streets. People didn't get into the embassy, but this isn't a normal day of work if you're working in an embassy, and it was certainly broadcast around the world and very concerning. That night, Ambassador Chris Stevens was murdered in the Libyan city, the eastern city of Benghazi, which is in many ways kind of a sister city to the Egyptian city of Alexandria. A lot of Egyptians were living in Benghazi at the time. There were a lot of Libyans in Alexandria. I was in Alexandria that night when this was all happening. Obviously a deeply shocking moment. Ambassador Stevens had previously served in Egypt, was well known and well liked by many people. A shocking moment, and one that also was happening amidst a US presidential election. Obviously we know that subsequently it became the source of lots of political fodder, but in terms of the conduct of diplomacy, in terms of a day in the life of the Foreign Service, with the morning starting off with the US Embassy in Cairo having the grounds being invaded and ending with an ambassador being murdered on the job, this was a very bad day for US foreign policy. Back in Cairo, it's just becoming clear now as things continue to fall apart that the prevailing narrative is that the Americans are to blame, that there's no way that Mohamed Morsi, this awkward, inelegant, unqualified, in the minds of many people, inefficient president would have gotten into power without the support of the US Embassy, without the personal support of Ambassador Patterson. I mean, this was the prevailing narrative. I personally don't find it to be true, but there's a reason that conspiracy theories take on such a life of their own, particularly in a place where people haven't had access to the right amount of information for a long time. They start to connect other dots. They start to see a hidden hand behind things where, in this case, I think there simply isn't one, because it makes for an explanation that somehow aligns with their own worldview. And I think we have to be honest and say there have been times when the US has been the hidden hand behind all sorts of machinations, and so it's not outrageous for people to think that such a thing might be happening. I think just in this case it's not true. Nevertheless, it was the prevailing narrative. And there was a movement that began, and some of my friends, some of my staff members were involved in this movement, the Tamarad movement, to rebel, to push back, and to basically, this was a petition drive to say Mohamed Morsi should step down 1 year after he took office. We should do a reset. We should have another election, that this whole thing has kind of taken a different turn than we all expected as Egyptians following the revolution. And that the Americans are supporting this group that now are being linked with terrorism, the Muslim Brotherhood specifically. So this narrative also starts to appear, that basically the supporters of the then sitting president of Egypt, Mohamed Morsi, are terrorists, and that the Americans are supporting them. In the beginning of the summer of 2013, you see long lines for gasoline. There were electricity cuts on a regular basis, which really gets your attention when it's 100 degrees out and your air conditioning doesn't work for a long period of time. I mean, I was fortunate enough to have air conditioning, but when there's no electricity, and I didn't have a generator, it just simply didn't work. And it was unclear if these kinds of things were happening because the system was just in such chaos, or if someone behind the scenes was manipulating the situation to make it chaotic for their own purposes. This young man was an intern for my organization, and unfortunately, he was killed in Alexandria under very unfortunate circumstances during the day, and it was deeply saddening to me, obviously tragic to his family and to his friends, but it also sent a real message to the American community in Egypt that anti-Americanism now seemed to be not just directed at policies, but also at people. Prior to this attack on this young man, there had been an American professor in Cairo who was stabbed in the neck outside the embassy. He survived, but he was wounded very severely. This was all happening just at this 1-year anniversary of Morsi taking office, this deadline that the petition movement had put in place for Morsi to step down, and now the military comes back to the fore. Remember, I had said the military had been in power since 1952. So the question as they come back to the fore, in a way, is, did they ever leave? Did they ever really leave the scene that they had been controlling from behind the scenes or not? This is still an area that's, very murky, and you will get differences of opinion from different people about the role of the military during Mohamed Morsi's 1-year tenure in office. But what is clear is that when Morsi was removed from office, General Sisi came to the fore as the new leader, and he's now President Sisi. Unlike 2011, though, when there was a revolution that was seeking to remove the president, President Mubarak, in this case there was also a pushback from the supporters of Morsi. And so in this square, you can see the Egyptian flag, which we were talking about before, but also signs like this that say yes to legitimacy and no to the coup. And it's an interesting choice of words. It's not to say yes to the Muslim Brotherhood or yes to Mohamed Morsi, but yes to a legitimately elected president. That whether you like him or not, he was elected through a free and fair process, and it's illegitimate to remove him. So this is a choice of words that I think is meant to not just send a message to other Egyptians, but back to Washington and to other places. That this is the kind of language that the U.S. Embassy was using about legitimacy and process. The U.S. wasn't saying we want to support Mohamed Morsi specifically, though some people would dispute what I just said, but they were saying we want to support a legitimate process. Now this creates quite a quandary in Washington, because if there is a coup d'etat in a country, under American law, we need to suspend the sending of aid, of foreign assistance. And so that's a lot of aid that goes to Egypt. As I said, almost $1.5 billion a year, year after year after year. And so to cut off that aid obviously throws a monkey wrench into the relationship between the US and the Egyptian military, which is now in the process of taking power back in 2013. But if you call it a revolution or you call it something else, it appears to just fly in the face of common sense. This is a military that has removed an elected president. So the Obama administration decided not to decide. They never made a pronouncement on whether this was a coup or not. Because there's a lot at stake in sending all of this kind of weaponry. And it's not just about the military to military relationship, though that's very important. And if you read, there's a relatively recent book by David Kirkpatrick, who was the Cairo bureau chief at the time for the New York Times. He's written a great book about this period and about what was going on in Washington as well as what was going on in Cairo. it's not just about that relationship. It's not just about the Pentagon dealing with the Egyptian generals, though it is that, and that scene is very important. But it's also about who makes these weapons, what jobs are created by them. And we can see President Trump now talking about the same sorts of things as Washington wrestles what to do with Saudi Arabia, something we can talk about in the Q&A period if you'd like. This is a real issue about how foreign assistance really happens politically. So Egypt for so long has been on this kind of annualized system of receiving this military materiel, that these jobs have been spread across the United States in both Democratic and Republican congressional districts. And if you cut off the aid, you cut off, in some cases, those jobs. And so the Obama administration found themselves also being pressured from Capitol Hill, including from members in their own party, to say, don't call this a coup, because this is going to affect jobs in my district. And if I'm a member of Congress, if you're running every 2 years, you're pretty much running all the time. You're always up for re-election, and that has real consequences. So they decided not to decide. More and more violence again. This is outside the very place where President Obama spoke. Bombs going off at Cairo University. People pushing back on the idea that General Sisi is now becoming, eventually would become President Sisi. You begin to see a well-orchestrated effort to have General Sisi legitimized in his position, both in the kinds of imagery that one sees in various countries where a new leader is taking power through this method. This is actually not a real magazine cover, but it was mocked up by people who were supporters of General Sisi. This was just the direction of things. We have since seen that journalists have been largely put under lots of pressure. Al Jazeera, which is based in Qatar, was especially problematic to the new Egyptian government because the government of Qatar was seen as supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. This is something that has played out more recently in difficulties between Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and the Saudis. There's many layers to these sorts of issues. We're just looking at Egypt as this one case study. I'll just skip that, and I'll just end with this. For no other reason except to say I'd like to end on a high note. This is Louis Armstrong and his wife in Egypt, and this harkens back, I think, to another moment in U.S.-Egyptian relations. And I would make an argument just to conclude that this is a moment that is not just nostalgic and nice to think about, but it was a time in which there was a more kind of nuanced way in which the U.S. was engaged in not just kind of military to military diplomacy, but also using public diplomacy, using culture, using education as a tool of diplomacy. And I think even amidst the kind of challenging moments that we have in U.S.-Egyptian relations now, it is worth reconsidering doing those things and not just relying on the more blunt instruments of weapon sales. So with that, I'll conclude and open up the floor to questions if you have any.
I will start the questioning by talking about Islam, asking about Islam and the current status of Islam and some of the stresses and problems that are existing these days. We're listening to every day now about Saudi Arabia, and we know that serious religious issues are there. Wahhabism dates back to the early period of the Arabs in the Middle East. You've mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood. I'm not sure that we know how it stands these days and in what countries it has strength. And finally, the Caliphate, ISIS, which is an extreme version of change in Muslim and Islam. Could you comment a little bit about that?
Sure, of course. I think even in your question, we can see, I think, what the way in which to think about the answer, which is to make a differentiation among the various manifestations of political versions of Islam. So as a beginning point, I disagree with the argument that I continue to hear made. I thought it was sort of done with, but it keeps coming back, that there's something inherently violent about Islam, and that Islam as a religion, Islam as a lived experience, is something that just by definition leads to violence. I think that that is no more the case than any other religion or philosophy. Nevertheless, I think it's important to start there because that argument is out there and maintains itself. In terms of the various other manifestations that you talked about, I think it's also useful to go back to the beginning point of my talk, which is Tunisia, and that the Tunisian Islamist party, the main Islamist party, which had for a long time been illegal and in opposition during President Ben Ali's regime, after the Egyptian revolution, has found a way to play a key role in the politics over the last few years in Tunisia, but at the same time not completely upend the system. And that other non-Islamist political actors have found a way to work with the Islamists in a way that accommodates them and basically allows for some pluralist view of the pluralist manifestation of politics in Tunisia. That's not to say it's all fine in Tunisia. It's not to say that Tunisia is in the clear and it's just going to be easy. We know from our own country that democracy is never easy. But it is to say that there's a way for Islam to play a role in politics and not have it take on the more extreme versions that you talked about, were things like ISIS. I think when we look at a group like ISIS, we can't see them in isolation also from the long-standing conflict that's going on in Syria and the deep dysfunctions of post-revolution and American occupation in Iraq. That ISIS's ability to regenerate itself, I think, has many things to do with mistakes that have been made by the Iraqi government, have been mistakes made by the Syrian, crimes committed by the Syrian government and by the Iraqi government, and enormous blunders by the American government and occupation of Iraq. And so that's not to let ISIS off the hook, but it's to say it's the way that it presents itself and that it finds some success has to do as much with what hasn't been happening in those countries as it does with Islam itself. So I think, I'm making an argument to say you have to put these things in broader context. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood now has been outlawed. So people who have remained in Egypt and our supporters have basically gone quiet, and leadership has scattered to Istanbul and to London and to some other places. And there's an ongoing debate within the Muslim Brotherhood about what next steps to take, whether to have a quietist approach, whether to re-enter politics in some other way, whether to take up arms, etc. So I think those are debates that are still happening. But I think this kind of varied approach, this ability to differentiate among different versions of political Islam, is an important starting point for us.
Thank you.
Jim, considering your response to Dick's question, I understand, and it's not a question of Islam being violent, but it seems that you're saying that the body politic in many of those countries is such that the only way to make any change is through some kind of a revolution, because the government is not going to make the change, and that will only have a narrow, short-term impact until something else happens. Am I far off base from what you've said?
Well, no, I don't think you're far off base at all. I mean, even if we think about the nature of revolutions beyond just the Middle East, beyond the so-called Arab Spring, revolutions bring about, they're extremely rapid, tumultuous, in many cases violent. I mean, the levels of violence varies from case to case, but these are revolutions are generally throughout history not moments that are going to lead to the kind of gradual evolution of political institutions and rule of law and the development of civil society. That the immediate times around, during, and following a revolution are ones that are probably going to be highly disruptive, unstable, and in many cases violent. And those situations, whether they take on an Islamic coloration or not, I think have to do with the nature of revolutions and what it means to have a revolution. In the case of Egypt, I think one of the interesting questions, both on a scholarly level but also on a policy level from capitals like Washington, is, was it really a revolution? And by that I mean, as I said before, the Egyptian military had been in power since 1952, and the various leaders who had been the head of Egypt since 1952, including Hosni Mubarak, came from the military. And so to have the military then basically assist in the removal of that president and then take over as the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, I think raises the question, well, how revolutionary was this? There were certainly revolutionary elements of it, that there were free and fair elections, that the Muslim Brotherhood took power, that new constitutions were written. But in the long-term sense of change, of revolutionary change, it appears not to be as revolutionary as it initially seemed to be and was certainly hoped to be. I think that's also not terribly unusual in the nature of revolutions throughout history, that you see this return to the previous regime or some version of it.
You mentioned revolution by definition, not by definition, by experience, is that the people who are fueling the revolution are against something, not necessarily for something. That they want to get rid of the anarchy and the terrorists and all the not terrorists, but the difficulty, but they don't really have either a vision of where they're going or the ability to make that happen. So it's a kind of an again, if you will. I'm against this, but I'm not necessarily for anything.
Yeah, so I think probably the ones that have led to more profound change, revolutions in history that have led to more profound change, have seen groups come to the fore that either were central to making the revolution happen and then following through on plans. I do think there have been cases of that, or are very adept at taking advantage of a revolutionary moment. So, clearly, pretty soon after the Iranian Revolution, there was a plan by the people who are still in power about how the nature of Iranian politics should be structured and conducted. And I think you could make the same case in Russia. But there's certainly a period of great tumult before that all happens, before the people who have these plans are able to put these plans in place. I think in Egypt, the challenge was twofold. One, that many of the people who were at the center of making the revolution happen just didn't have kind of the wherewithal in terms of resources, strategy, assistance from other quarters, et cetera, to kind of put in place any specific plan. So I think your description of being against something, being against the police, being against the Mubarak administration is quite accurate. And that was always the concern, particularly as we get to the end of 2011 and into 2012, that the group that did seem to have the ability to marshal its resources, that was highly organized and had a very specific plan in place for decades, was the Muslim Brotherhood. So, but it could well be that the military either had a plan or was formulating a plan as they went along as well. So neither of them were seen as having plans that were revolutionary in the way that was envisioned in Tahrir Square amidst those initial high hopes.
I want to ask you, I think you're uniquely set up. You discuss the problems with Egypt, and there's always the ocean of discussion about our mistakes in a hard, immediate situation in Iraq. And I think you're uniquely gifted to ask, specifically, what are some of the terrible mistakes that we made after the second occupation of Iraq, as you mentioned, that have led to a terrible situation there? American foreign policy.
Well, the first thing I would say is that I think the decision to invade Iraq was maybe one of the worst decisions in the history of U.S. foreign policy. It was not based on accurate intelligence. It wasn't based on a strategy that made any sense. Certainly doing so in the wake of 9/11, though somehow it was able to be kind of sold to the public, didn't make any sense whatsoever. I mean, one very well-placed person said, attacking Iraq after 9/11 would be sort of like attacking Mexico after Pearl Harbor. It just didn't make any sense. But people had other agendas. And it went in, it was formulated in a way that was completely devoid of an understanding of the situation on the ground. In fact, going back and looking, kind of deconstructing of how it was all put together, for the people who really did know Iraq, for the people who had served in Iraq in the State Department, who had a deep knowledge of the place, were largely cut out of the process. And the people who had a more political agenda were added into the process. And so I think the decision to do it, the formulation of it, the way that it was pitched to the American public, the way that it was done in a unilateral way, and not working with our allies, all of that essentially set it up for failure. So from the very beginning, it couldn't succeed. Then once it did happen, the U.S. military is very good at what they do. And by that, I mean they're very good at carrying out military operations. So the invasion of Iraq, the removal of the Iraqi government happened very quickly, as planned, and I think as anticipated by everyone who was in charge. What the U.S. military is not good at, and I think if any of my friends were here who are in the military, they would agree to this, is setting up local governments, working with town councils, doing democracy promotion. You know, this is the work of USAID, the work of the State Department, the very organizations that had initially been cut out of the process were brought in after the fact, including an organization that I ran at the time. But by that point, things were already on the verge of getting pretty chaotic. I think it's largely agreed that one of the initial huge mistakes was the de-Baathification of Iraqi politics and Iraqi society. So to say that anyone who had been involved in the Ba'ath Party, the ruling party, would now no longer be eligible to be in the army or to play a key role or a role in governing the country. This was a huge number of people. This was a single-party state for a long time. And not surprisingly, a fair number of those de-Baathified Iraqi army officers later found common cause with ISIS. So that really had almost nothing to do with Islam or the restoration of the caliphate, but had everything to do with the restoration of their standing and their privileges. And these were and are army officers who are highly trained, have combat experience. And so, you know, when you see pictures of some of the people in ISIS, and, you know, just it can look like just a small group of young guys, you know, tooling around in these pickup trucks, and you think, how have they won any battles? And what you don't see is the old Iraqi army behind the scenes working closely with them, people who really know their business. So I think that started off the situation as a huge with a huge error as well. So I'll leave it at that. The decision, the formulation of the decision, the implementation of the decision, the selling of the decision, and then the de-Baathification of the political structure and the military, I think, you know, really set things up for failure. This is something that has had and continues to have such ripple effects throughout the region. And, you know, we see that the U.S. has been engaged militarily in the Middle East pretty much nonstop since the first Gulf War in the early 90s. I mean, even during President Clinton's administration, when we were enforcing no-fly zones in the north and the south of Iraq, I think I recall correctly that the United States dropped more bombs, more ordnance in general, on Iraq during that period than we did in Europe during World War II. And so we've continued this military, highly military approach. I think what we've essentially done is we've taken a lot of the tools out of our toolbox, the diplomatic tools, and we're down to just a couple, and most of them are military. The sale of military weapons and the deployment of our forces, we have big military bases there, and the engagement in combat. I mean, we recently have seen the news that went by and almost nobody even paid attention to it because it doesn't even seem like news anymore, that we appear now to, it's not a huge number, but we're going to have combat troops in Syria indefinitely. Indefinitely. And we're on the precipice of a next round of elections, of our midterm elections. I think members of Congress of either party should be asked directly, so what do you think about this? Where do you stand on this policy? You, a member of the House of Representatives, fund this. So what do you think? Are we there indefinitely? What's the plan? What are we supposed to be doing there? How are we going to get out? Et cetera. And that doesn't seem like an outrageous question for citizens to ask their representatives, yet I don't hear it being asked at all. So anyway, that's a long answer to your question.
Let me just jump in and ask you if you would care to make a few comments on Iran in the same area.
On Iran. So there's been a lot of criticism from both sides of the aisle about the Iranian nuclear deal that was put in place by the Obama administration. Like any of these big diplomatic deals, certainly not perfect. And the way in which as I understand it, that the people who negotiated the deal were able to get it down to a conclusion was to have it be a very narrowly framed deal, which specifically dealt with the nuclear issue. So it didn't deal with the other things that have been brought back to the fore to say, like, well, this makes it a bad deal. Specifically, Iran's development of non-nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles in particular, the role of Iran around the region, which has, I think anyone would argue, is not positive, and in many cases, and also the conduct of the Iranian government at home against their own citizens. All of these, I think, are valid things to raise as we think about our overall relationship with Iran, but they were specifically left out of the Iranian nuclear deal because if they had been part of it, there never would have been a deal. So it was a decision made in terms of negotiations to say, okay, we can't solve all those other things, though we do need to continue to address them, but we can solve this one issue of nuclear weapons and the development of those weapons in Iran, or we can appear to solve them. It's obviously up for debate. And so I think those continue to be, major issues. What's interesting, though, is that, the Middle East it's a very complicated place. And so we see that in some cases, for a long time, the United States and the Iranians have been not working together, but working alongside each other in Iraq. Iraq is, largely under the sway of the Iranians now, and we've opened up that by invading Iraq. We opened up that possibility, which is now a reality. And in other places where we find ourselves at loggerheads with the Iranians. So it's very complicated. I think also, canceling the deal is not just a question about what do we think about the direction of Iran and the development of nuclear weapons and what's more likely to forestall their development of nuclear weapons, but also our relationship with the other parties who negotiated that deal on our side, the other members of the Security Council and Germany as well, and that this has further strained those relations.
Tyler.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I loved your visuals, and I'm very glad I was not at that gas station trying to buy gas.
Yeah, right.
That looked pretty miserable. What is your sense of what's going on right today in Egypt and Cairo in terms of the public feelings about Sisi and his regime, and are there any outside players who are now getting more influential, vis-a-vis Egyptian politics and the status of the regime? And is Sisi implementing any significant domestic initiatives that are actually going to make life in Egypt for the average person any better? I.e., how's the local economy doing?
Yeah, well, the economy is an important place to start in answering that question, because I think it just highlights the very difficult position that President Sisi is in. And he inherited a mess of an economy, and he also inherited several decisions that had been put off for a very long time. The can had been kicked down the road again and again and again. So the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, has been saying to Egypt for a long time, and saying as a condition of continued support from the IMF that the Egyptians need to do certain things. And previous governments have not wanted to do them, like other governments who work with the IMF don't want to do them because they cause some pain, some real, tangible pain at the beginning of these things. So one of them was that Egypt had to allow their currency to float. When I lived there, I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think $1 got you about 7 or 8 pounds. I think it was 8. Now it's $1 to about 15 pounds. So this has really affected Egyptians' daily life. and their purchasing power. And it's really been very painful. At the same time, this is something that all economists say needed to be done, that the President Sisi needed to do it. And other kind of price supports and that whole host of things that the IMF has always focused on, these kind of difficult pull off the Band-Aid sort of things. Sisi and his people have been doing them. They've been working hard to bring back tourism to Egypt, which has been difficult in the face of some high-profile terrorist attacks. But they've worked hard to do that. The economy is very dependent on tourism. The role of the military in the economy, I think, is also something that needs to be regularized. The Egyptian military has kind of ownership of many things that are not specifically military, but are key parts of the economy. So these are all painful things, painful economically and painful politically, yet they appear to be underway. There's the construction of a new capital center going on outside of Cairo. There's been developments in the Suez Canal. At the same time, others raise serious concerns about rule of law and human rights and freedom of expression, et cetera. So I was just there this summer, and I think it's a mixed bag. I think that's the most honest. I think in Washington there's one view of a lot of this, and in Cairo there's another, and somewhere in between I think probably lies the reality.
Thank you.
We have time for one or two more questions, and I want to move first of all to my kind friend who here has been waiting quite a long time.
Thank you very much for your explanations. I would like to come back to what you said earlier about changing the policy, the U.S. policy, and reintroducing USAID, changing the mind of the people through cultural exchange and support. Given even if Congress were to change to a democratically controlled body, what is your view of how long improvements might take and the money that it will take to bring this about? To get away from military aid to economic aid, to create a sort of Marshall Plan? Or has the International Monetary Fund taken over for this? And how do you personally see this process going forward, given the long period that it would take, probably several administrations?
Yes, I think it could certainly take a long time, because everything in government tends to take a long time. But the thing about the sorts of programs that you mentioned and that I was referring to earlier is that they're not that expensive, really. I mean, they sound expensive if we just look at them in isolation, maybe a program that costs $1 million here or $1 million there, but they're nothing compared to the $1.3 billion in annual foreign assistance, most of which is military, not all of it. Some of it is in the category of what's called economic support funds. I think it's well within the realm of the possible to do it. I do think also that in the Congress, there's been largely bipartisan support for many of these things. So the main part of the State Department that undertakes these exchange programs, et cetera, is the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. When the Trump administration first came into office, their initial budget anticipated closing that bureau down completely, zeroing it out. But the Republicans on the Hill pushed back, and they didn't want to do that, because that would mean ending things like the Fulbright program, the International Visitors Leadership Program, and many things that you probably all are aware of as well, highly successful programs. The reality is that those kinds of programs have seen diminished support over the years from administrations that are both Democrat and Republican. that it just hasn't been seen as the same sort of priority, particularly in the Middle East. Now, in Egypt, I should say that there are some programs that USAID is undertaking that are very successful, that are training, taking Egyptians from very difficult economic circumstances, teaching them English, teaching them study skills, giving them a boost to go to college, either in Egypt or somewhere else in the world, and ideally in the U.S. in as many cases as possible, though far too few Egyptians study in the U.S. And there's been some fairly large programs that have been put in place to do that. I would just say, though, that's just a drop in the bucket, and it's just not enough, and we just need to do more of that, because I think we can easily see the positive results of it. And I do think that there is bipartisan support generally, but there hasn't been enormous support from White Houses of several varieties.
Let me just step in then and remark on how high quality of this presentation has been, Jim, and the multiple areas that you have managed to cover through a wide range of questions. Thank you very much, and we one of these days we may invite you back to talk with some more about these things. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. I very much enjoyed it.